There is a manuscript in the Archivo General de Indias in Seville, filed in 1542, catalogued but for practical purposes, unread for the better part of 350 years. Here's what's actually on the page. 15 miles of continuous riverbank settlement in the Amazon basin, no gap between one house and the next. A standing defensive force of 50,000 men, aged 30 to 70, holding a line for 2 days and 2 nights without breaking. Roads wide, engineered, running inland from the river wide enough that the men who tried to follow one turned back, unsettled by what its width implied about what was waiting at the other end. I want to be precise about what I'm claiming and what I'm not. I'm not telling you there was a lost Amazonian empire erased by design. I don't have enough evidence to make that claim, and I don't think anyone does. What I'm telling you is simpler, and I think harder to dismiss. A man was there in 1542, and he wrote down what he saw. What he saw does not match what got taught as settled fact for the next 3.5 centuries. And the record of why his account went quiet is thinner than it should be, given how much depended on it staying that way. I looked at the manuscript for a long time. Then I went looking for what it showed. What this document shows is not a curiosity. It shows a version of the Amazon that contradicts the one most of us were taught: cities, standing armies, glazed ceramics, finer than anything 16th century Malaga produced. Agricultural systems dense enough to feed those cities without exhausting the soil beneath them. The record confirms that version existed. What the record does not confirm is why it stopped being visible for 353 years. Here is what the surviving documentation tells us about the world this manuscript describes. Carvajal recorded that the Omagwa chieftainship's territory extended roughly 80 leagues along the river, something close to 200 miles, with villages spaced less than a crossbow shot apart. At Machiparo, in May of 1542, he recorded warriors rotating in relays from the settlements along the bank, so that as one group tired, a fresh group replaced them, holding the defensive line against Orellana's boats for 2 full days without a break in the pattern. He recorded raiding a storehouse and finding glazed, multicolored ceramic vessels of a quality he compared, without qualification, to the finest pottery of Malaga. None of this reads as an aside. It reads as an inventory. To the people living inside that world, none of it would have been remarkable. The roads were roads. The pottery was pottery. The rotating defense at the riverbank was simply how a densely populated territory defended a densely populated riverbank. It was the ordinary texture of a world that had existed long enough that no one inside it needed to explain it to anyone. Here is where the record goes quiet. Carvajal's manuscript was submitted to the Spanish crown after the expedition returned. It was catalogued into the imperial archive in Seville, and there it stayed unpublished, unread by anyone beyond a narrow circle of officials for 353 years. That same year, a second account of the same expedition began circulating. Gonzalo Fernández de Oviedo y Valdez's version, which accused Orellana of treason and mutiny against Gonzalo Pizarro. Oviedo's account was published in 1855. Carvajal's was not transcribed and published until 1895 by the Chilean historian José Toribio Medina. For most of 3 centuries, the version of events that circulated was the one that cast doubt on the witness who had actually been there. This is not the silence of a fire or a flood or a war. Those silences produce their own documentation, damage reports, casualty counts, accounts of what was lost. This silence produced nothing of that kind. Carvajal's testimony was present. Then, for practical purposes, it was not. The record does not contain a decision to bury it. It contains an accident of circulation, compounded, later, by a scientific consensus that had no reason to doubt what it had never read. In 1971, the anthropologist Betty Meggers published Amazonia, Man and Culture in a Counterfeit Paradise, arguing on ecological grounds that the tropical forest could never have sustained the population Carvajal described. By then, the manuscript had already been in print for 76 years. It didn't matter. The consensus had already been built on something else. The manuscript in Seville is dated 1000 542. It describes cities that, by the time European naturalists returned to the same river corridor in later centuries, were no longer there to be described. The archive holds no follow-up survey confirming what happened to those settlements in the interim. This is either because no one went looking, or because whatever they found didn't fit into the categories anyone was using to record it. The record does not say which. I looked for the same kind of silence somewhere else, and I found it repeatedly in places that had nothing to do with each other except the shape of what went missing. At the Hatahara site, on a bluff above the Solimões River near Manaus, Brazil, soil cores show a continuous anthropogenic horizon terra preta, Amazonian dark earth built up by human activity from around 450 BCE through roughly 950 CE. Radiocarbon dating confirms 1400 years of continuous soil engineering, and then it stops. Nothing in the archaeological record explains the stopping. The chemistry simply changes from actively managed to passively inherited. 1400 miles from the manuscript in Seville, the same silence in the same place in the record. In the Llanos de Mojos, in the Bolivian Amazon, the Casarabe culture built two urban centers, Cotoca at 315 hectares and Landivar at 147, connected by nearly 1,000 kilometers of raised causeways, anchored by conical earthen pyramids, rising 22 meters into the canopy. These cities were occupied from roughly 500 to 1,400 CE. They do not appear in any archaeological record after that. They remained invisible to science until 2022, when an airborne LiDAR survey published in Nature revealed their outlines beneath 5 centuries of regrown forest, 1,500 miles from the manuscript. The same silence in the same place in the record. And in Seville itself, the archive holding the manuscript that started this, the document goes quiet in the most literal sense. Filed in 1542, rediscovered and transcribed in 1895. 353 years in which the single most detailed eyewitness account of this world sat in a building, physically present, administratively inert. The world the manuscript shows did not disappear in one place. It stopped appearing in the record in at least 3 locations, across 2 countries, over a span that runs from the 16th century to the 21st. The silences are not identical. A soil core going quiet is not the same kind of event as a manuscript going unread, but they have the same shape. That shape is not the shape of gradual change. Gradual change leaves arguments for and against, partial adoptions, holdouts, minutes of meetings where someone objected. This shape is different. This is the shape of something that stopped being recorded before anyone wrote down why. Here is the question I kept returning to. Not, why did this world disappear? How does something stop being visible without anyone deciding to make it invisible? Here is the answer, as far as the record supports one. A world becomes invisible to a record when the record's categories no longer contain it, not through fire, not through a decision, through the ordinary administrative act of updating the vocabulary. The tropical Amazon had a name in the vocabulary that produced Carvajal's account: settled, populated, engineered territory. That name effectively disappeared from the working vocabulary of the sciences that studied the region in the 19th and 20th centuries. Once the name was gone, the land could not be recorded as what it had been. It could be recorded as something else: wilderness, primeval forest, uncultivable jungle. But not as what the soil chemistry and the tree canopy and the LiDAR scans now confirm it actually was. And what cannot be named in the record cannot be protected by the record. What cannot be protected becomes available to theory, to doubt, to erasure by omission. The vocabulary that replaced the old one arrived gradually across the 19th and 20th centuries and calcified formally in 1971 with Meggers's monograph. After that point, for most practical purposes, the manuscript in Seville was the only surviving record that the older word city, in a place officially designated wilderness, had ever been necessary. If you're still with me, that's the part of this that's easiest to walk past a vocabulary quietly closing off a version of reality nobody was in the room to defend. It's also the part worth sitting with for a second before we keep going. If that's useful to you, subscribing costs nothing and it helps this kind of research keep happening. Gonzalo Fernández de Oviedo y Valdés is in Spain in 1542 at a writing table doing the job the crown paid him to do. He is a royal chronicler. His responsibility is to record the affairs of the Indies accurately enough to satisfy an administration that cared about loyalty as much as accuracy. He writes his account of the Orellana expedition. In it, he accuses Orellana of mutiny and treason against Gonzalo Pizarro. He is not lying maliciously. As far as the record shows, he is recording the version of events that reflected badly on a man who had, in the crown's eyes, abandoned his commanding officer in the field. His account is published, eventually, in 1855. It circulates. It shapes what gets believed about the expedition for centuries. Carvajal's manuscript, filed the same year, does not circulate at all. They were not making a decision about the Amazon. Oviedo was filing an official account of a political betrayal in the vocabulary his position required of him. And in doing exactly that, he became part of the mechanism. One chronicler, one account, filed in 1 year, in one archive. The manuscript that actually described the cities predates none of this. It was written the same year, by a man who was there. Oviedo did not know, and had no reason to know, that the account he was sidelining contained the only surviving eyewitness description of a civilization that would take 3.5 centuries to be believed again. What happened to Carvajal's testimony is not a mystery solved at the top. It is a process completed at a writing table. I want to be honest about what this record cannot show me. Not as a disclaimer, as the most precise thing I can say about what this research found. It cannot establish whether Oviedo's account displacing Carvajal's was a deliberate act of discrediting or simply what an ambitious chronicler wrote in the ordinary course of his job. It cannot establish whether the scientists who built 20th century consensus on an uncultivable Amazon were aware Carvajal's manuscript existed, or whether they would have changed their model if they had read it. And it cannot establish whether the pattern I've laid out, Hatahara, the Llanos de Mojos, Seville is one connected disappearance, or 3 unrelated disappearances that happen to resemble each other because unread evidence and unexcavated soil produce the same kind of silence anywhere in the world. What the manuscript shows is real. What the soil chemistry shows is real. What the LiDAR survey shows is real. The shape of the silence across all 3 is real. What I cannot show you is the intent behind that shape. A shape without documented intent is not proof of a conspiracy. It's a description of what the record contains and what it does not. I'll also say this plainly. I spent a long time with this manuscript before I went looking for the pattern around it. A mind that spends that long with one document starts finding its meaning everywhere. I'm not exempt from that. What I'm asking you to consider is whether the record I've shown you actually requires the pattern I've described, or whether a simpler explanation accounts for all of it. I have not found the simpler explanation. That is not my conclusion. That is where the research stopped. There is one thing that connects this world to where we are now. It's called Terra Preta Amazonian Dark Earth. It exists today in horizons up to 2 meters deep, at sites including Hatahara, on the bluff above the Solimões. It is accessible. Brazilian farmers dig it up and haul it to their fields as topsoil, because more than 1,000 years after it was engineered, it is still more fertile than the natural ground around it. It did not survive because anyone protected it. It survived because the vocabulary that reclassified the Amazon as wilderness had no category for soil that a civilization had spent centuries building. The system could process forest. It could not process an ancient farm still functioning as one. The manuscript is still in Seville. It still shows the same 15 miles of continuous settlement, the same 50,000 men, the same roads running into the interior that the Spaniards were afraid to finish exploring. Nothing about the physical pages has changed. What has changed is what those pages contain. Now that you know the soil underneath the forest that grew back over those cities is still there, still fertile, still being dug up by people who don't necessarily know its full history. This world was not destroyed. It was processed through a vocabulary that had no designation for a city and a place officially classified as wilderness, no instrument for measuring an agricultural system that looked, from the outside, like undisturbed jungle, and no category for what it would have cost to keep recording it as what it actually was. The dark earth remains, and if you look at it long enough, it tells you exactly how a world stops being visible, not through fire, not through a decision, through the completely ordinary act of no one writing down the word that would have kept it in the record. The next time you walk past a stretch of forest that looks untouched, dense, tangled, apparently wild, you'll be walking past the kind of landscape the manuscript shows. It will look the way it always looks. The signage, if there is any, will use the vocabulary that replaced the one Carvajal used. You won't be able to tell the difference from the outside. That's the one part of this the manuscript can't show you, what it felt like to stand inside that world before the word for it disappeared.